coming. It's great to have such an audience for English poetry, which is not something that has been very popular for a long time in Pakistan. Let me just give you an outline. We plan to read from who we call the greats, 3-4 great poets who wrote in the 60s and 70s, and many of us are their students who they edited our work. We ourselves were young poets at the time. In 1965, Oxford University Press published the first of 3 books of English poetry written by Pakistanis. The publication of First Voices in 1965 was a landmark event, and today we offer you a celebration of those great early poets of Pakistan who are largely forgotten today by the younger generation. The other books published were Pieces of 8 in 1971 and Wordfall in 1975. These elders were our teachers, and they had been writing poetry since the 1950s. In the late 60s, they mentored some of us and edited our poems. We were, if you like, a second generation of young poets writing in English. We were published in Pakistani magazines, but like our elders, we too were quickly forgotten. And many of us actually stopped writing poetry and went into writing prose or journalism or other things. Let me read you what Shahid Hussain, one of the original greats, wrote in the introduction to First Voices in 1965. Remember, this was 45 years ago. Driven by necessity or impelled by some interior urgency, many Pakistani writers have chosen to express themselves in English. They have led so far a devious and twilight existence. There has been the problem of finding outlets, the stifling awareness of working in a vacuum through which no voices travel. There is no enthusiastic assent, no informed hostility. In a word, no response. In other words, these poets got a very limited response. Now, he wrote this so many years ago, and to bring back to life these early poets, let me introduce you on stage. We have Navid Shahzad, actor and educationalist. Samina Rahman, educationalist and women's rights activist. Khaled Ahmed, journalist and writer. Athar Tahir, prize-winning scholar and art historian. Henna Babar, poet and scholar. And myself, a journalist. And I'm going to ask people to be reading a couple of poems of the greats with a concentration on Tawfiq Rafat, because he is by far the greatest English language poet that Pakistan has produced. So I'll first ask Khaled Ahmed to start with a couple of poems from Tawfiq.
Before I read the first poem, let me say that if I was looking for any message from his poetry, I was deluded, because he was a poet of the senses. He was a pagan. He celebrated nature, and there was wisdom in whatever he wrote on the basis of his senses. The first poem I'm going to read is Jolt the World, and it is based on nature. And it is his remarkable imagery which will catch your attention. Jolt the world from its long summer's sleep. Bold monsoon wind, blow yet more strong. Catch and bend and truss the pink eucalyptus. Dandle the light birds on your heaving lap, and make each cave of leaves burst into song. Let your wild hair down, shake the sky sieve. Strike a match against the cloud's brown rump. Skip lightly over the taut aerial wire, and dance, dance, dance with each falling leaf. With your pellets, make the proud pawns jump. The second poem is about a superannuated paterfamilias. He's been a civil servant probably and is retired, and this is how the family now introduces him. The children understand him. Children understand him, and only this has kept intact his pride and self-respect. Otherwise, he's a dry stream bed, living on memories and an inadequate pension, and the hospitality now given, now revoked, of his sons and daughters. An old man who must be humored and sent to his room when there are guests about, but always to be relied on to keep the children upstairs and out of mischief. Yes, they understand him, from man roar and friendly punches to the chest and damp kisses on scrubbed cheeks, they sail to the honor of his knees.
I'll ask now Samina Rahman to read her brother's poems, Shahid Hussein's.
Ahmed has already said that Shahid Hussain edited the first anthology of English verse back in 1965. This was called First Voices. And Ahmed said to give a little background, Shahid Hussain was, for most of his life, a bureaucrat. He loved reading and writing, but he was a bureaucrat, and then he was posted as with NAFDEC, which was the National Film Development Corporation. And NAFDEC made a film which was ironically and aptly called The Blood of Hussain. And it turned out that it was the blood of Hussain, because Ziaul Haq came into power, and Mr. Shahid Hussain was dismissed summarily, and cases were instituted against him. So then he left the country, and he settled abroad, where he set up an antiquarian bookshop. This is just to give you a little background. The first poem that I will read is concerning the difficulties of faith in hot climates. Bending to the darkening west to praise the attributes of my ancestral God, I find a silence in the hard-packed earth. I sense rejection in the draining sky, and know the reason why. Around me now, carrion clusters, vultures wait, and the wind opens hell's furnace, even when the land lies drowned under the moon. Flower and root lose life, and fragrance on the yellowed grass. The windowed streets burn lens-hard, acid on the naked eye. The roads grow treacherous underfoot, walking and moving in a molten stream of asphalt. If such life contains me, if I must learn to praise and do obeisance to these barren wastes, hard prayers will grow upon a stony heart, flint striking flint, the sparks a pale and instant gleam under the sun. This is the spider home, nomad country, scuttling and hunting life from rock to rock, grey, watchful, devious, only they persist in an opposition of fire and sand. So when I bring ritual and gesture to my rich devotions, the earth refuses, and the noon-high sun permits no shadow to these moves of faith. You want me to read the second one also? It's slightly longer. I can't cut it. Doesn't make sense there. The other is a slightly longer poem. This was published in a collection of Commonwealth verse, and it's called Wedding. Brightness falls from the air, from ankle and elbow, from heaving gold bosom. Curving flash of knee below silk makes night giddy. Pace color on the muddy, unenlightened street before it falters, plods hesitant in the creek and shuffle of the unconcerned bullock cart. Here it will linger, dispersed and occupied by risen dust. Beneath the shaking lights, Gul Khan the servant is sad. His stiff martial moustache is sodden with tears and stolen whiskey. He drowns in grief for the princess, the shining doll, leaving her home for harsh and alien arms. His pretty plaything, carried for years on his back, now lures her silvered eyes and will not speak. So Gul Khan, the Puritan, lecherous Pathan, staggers with the parachute sway of the Ghararas and denies the ambit of their tented warmth, weeps and swigs his stolen whiskey, placating his anger with unfamiliar fire. The shining bride is crying, they say, shaking with silent grief, huddled and bowed, gold circling her arms, lying cold on her forehead, gripping her feet. The gold-burdened bride is crying. They tell the groom, appraising him angrily as he hesitates into a sea of women. A whisper, a vicarious purr of desire crowds the couple as they bend to the misting mirror. A meeting of frightened eyes, a brief ritual of knowledge broken by hennaed and jangling hands, a shiver of bright laughter, a hum of orthodoxy. The Shahnai's lament, the music of this moment coils serpentine, bright, dangerous, familiar sound causing familiar sorrow. The quick taps of the tabla lesson beat resonant and slow beneath the young voices singing the silent parting. The doll's wedding is over. They sing, a real groom now comes to bruise these pliant, leaning arms, to crush her bangles in a strong embrace. Why have you sold me, father, ask the voices, into this world of blood and broken glass? So her mother retreats in grief to elaborate sorrow. Her father blesses her with a shower of small coins as she stumbles, besieged by petals to the car, whose metal hides under jasmine and marigolds, whose headlights blaze, whose Japanese bugle horn sounds merrily through the reducing dust. Crows snap across the moon-darkened sky, and as usual, the children gather with catapults, their pockets bulging with smooth round stones, waiting the final settling of the birds. Their mothers shout abuse, but they are tired, and there are so many children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you can see, very little has changed in our marriage ceremonies over so many years. I'm now going to ask Athar Tahir to introduce the only woman in this group, who is called Machi Qureshi, and he'll say a few words about her and then read a couple of her poems.
Thank you, Ahmed. Born in 1927 into a Parsi family in Calcutta, Machi Qureshi taught English at the Karachi University. She died in 1995. Her body of work is modest, but of a high caliber. Her physical disability, her sensitive female voice, her delicate evocation of human dilemmas permeate her poetry, according it a particular poignancy. Today I would like to recite two of her poems, which are my personal favorites, for the richness of issues raised with such accomplished craftsmanship. The first is called Day. Across the garden, a koel shouts and wakes me up to dawn. From under clouds, the sun rises to the bait of its song. A day lyric as old Persian glass that snares the light's intrigue to celebrate beginnings. Like a bell, God's name shatters the air, and usurping birds lose voice. A chameleon disturbed the exuberance of grass, evoke a grace I'm weary of. A benediction like the desert rain, too comforting to last. Yet light is a holy thought until the crow lifts an assassin beak that stabs and stabs. I think of Umar, absorbed in the quietude of prayer. The chameleon writes, I cannot hear it scream. Its tail loops like a hangman's noose around the sun, pulls up a jerking body. The beak scissors as God's repeated name dies on the air. The second is called Kittens. There are too many kittens. Even the cat is dismayed at this overestimation of her stock and slinks away. Kind friends cannot adopt them all. My relatives say, take them to a bazaar and let them go, each to his destiny. They live off pickings, but they're so small. Somebody may step on one like a tomato. Or, too fastidious to soil a polished shoe, will kick it out of his path. If they survive the gaunt dogs and battering heels, they will starve, gently squealing a little less each day. The European thing to do is to drown them. Warm water is advised to lessen the shock. They're so small, it takes only a minute. You hold them down and turn your head away. Then the water shatters. Your hands are frantic eels, oddly like landed fish, their blunt pink mouths open and shut. Legs strike out, each claw a delicate nail. Pairing is bared. They are blind and will not know you did this to them. The water recomposes itself, snagged by two cultures. Which shall I choose?
I think all of us spent a lot of time at the feet of Tawfiq Rafat, learning from him not only the art of poetry, but the art of living and thinking and reading and contemplating and understanding nature. And I think, that love for him lives in all of us, even today. I'm going to ask now Henna Babar Ali to read for us another couple of poems by Tawfiq.
I'm going to read two poems by Tawfiq Rafat. One is called Indestructible and the other is Things Left Undone. Indestructible. I thought younger but tougher, always bullying your brother. The uncles called you bulldog, lingering at the gates of my friends till they called you in, showing off your lieutenant pips to mother who kissed them. Tall, just man, with the rough exterior optimist. Mutual memories, now they are mine. Things left undone. Things left undone lie on your desk, underlined and annotated. They do not matter anymore, along with anniversaries and visiting cards. Into the basket they go. They must have cost time and money, so many sleepless nights.
I'm going to read you a couple of poems from my cousin, Kaleem Omar, whose sister is here today. Unfortunately, Kaleem passed away and is not with us. Kaleem was Tawfiq's very best friend. They spent a lot of time together working on each other's poems. We were always in awe of watching them work together. Kaleem, as many of you know, went on to become a journalist. He moved to Karachi from Lahore and then started writing for The Star and then for the News and became a prolific journalist. He was also, frankly, a prolific poet. He wrote thousands of poems, which unfortunately have still not even been collected. Kaleem used to boast that he had 70 first cousins. And he was very proud of the fact that he had the Umar family, which was his family, that his family was one of the largest in Pakistan. And everybody was connected to everybody else. So let me read you first a very poignant poem of his called Poem for My Father. Both his parents died when he was quite young. Father, it was 13 years ago that we buried you among thorns in a dusty graveyard. My brother and I were out at sea after bloaters the day you died. When the boat came in, the news of your death sprang at us from the mouth of a distant relative. waiting at the dock to take us home. I remember noticing as we ran for the car how hot the sun still was on our back. The room in which your large body lay, covered by a single inadequate sheet, was a murmur of familiar voices, made strange by third-person repetitions of your name. My old grandmother renewed her grief into the hollows of your shroud. Cousins, sisters, brothers, a whole clan encircled a fallen view of the man and were unnerved for the first time without the affection of your certain hand. The funeral still lives in the minds of those left to mourn the dreams you made so real that nothing seemed quite impossible. I remember how we would sit quietly hour after hour and listen to your plans for offering to build the new Aswan Dam, or schemes for a house in which the large, now scattered family would again gather each year over winter holidays. There would be a special room for children, and in the same compound you would build 5 cottages for your sisters and their broods. All would be gathered in again to grow up, knowing each other as families should know, the smaller parts that make the larger whole. Your presence held these presences together and kept our laughter from ringing false. Now we plunge headlong on our separate ways with all the discord of runners out of breath. Much more than one man perished in that death. 13 years later, my younger brother is half a stranger in another country. 2 of your 4 brothers and a sister are also dead. Another brother and a sister live with the aftermath of heart attacks. The family business continues to slide downward to a fast approaching end. 2 marriages have broken up. Others are quarreling. A full catalogue of woe. Father, accept us. We have nowhere else to go. And a short poem, another short poem by Kaleem, The Softness of Some Words. The softness of some words is like a woman's softness. Sorrow in April rain, heart beats flutter to the ground, gentle summer touches give willingness a shape. Color and time are many things running on a seagull's wings. Hair, a blowing memory, echoes wanton syllables. Eyes kiss and shadows fall are cool and finally beautiful. But your name, whispered in the dark, is pain and love and all of these. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Nivi Shahzad to read 2 poems also from Tawfiq.
This was a man who manufactured sports goods. And his verse and he himself are stretched as taut as the catgut that he meshed his rackets with. There was a stillness about the man which belied the tempests within, and that's where his verse comes in. My favorite quote from Tawfiq, who was friend, mentor, and also his wife belonged to the extended Wazirabad clan, which he used to tease me about mercilessly. He says, the person we think we are is always the one who has disappeared round the corner. And that, to me, says enough about his poetry. Despite the fact that Tawfiq had one of the most wonderful eyes for observation, be it climate, be it season, be it the little details, the little coffee spoons that make up our life. He was meticulous about recording all that. And that's why I'm going to read this poem, which is called The Squalor in Which Some People Live. The squalor in which some people live disgusts me. And when I see a man urinating on the road, it makes me mad. Dear God, have I forgotten so soon my own beginnings? The oblique house in Shah Alam, where my mother was born, is no longer there. In its place stands a dry fountain, a symbol of the act that severed a continent. But it inflames the eye of memory like a moat, room piled upon room, and not a ventilator anywhere to let the stale air out. Down one side, a gutter ran like a saw, the other shared with a Hindu dealer in brass. My grandfather, splendidly moustached, boisterous, semi-naked, who turned from mashing bones to mending them, the most skillful bone setter of his day, with a certificate from Lord Kitchener to prove it. Still young at 80, held court on the ground floor, surrounded by the appurtenances of his trade and the patient's relatives. I can see him, cajoling a wayward bone into place, cannily aided by a burst of invective so fierce it makes me shudder still. As we stood by, at a respectful distance, memorizing his words, he pointed us out to his neighbors proudly as the children of a millionaire, hastily adding, of course he did not care a damn. In that smell of oil and lint and dung and unaired quilts, how carefree we were. For a few ecstatic weeks each winter, like the barna tree, all flower and no leaf. The filth was part of us as we grew tall in that time of love. The hands of the clock in moving forward are moving back. The family business slides downwards imperceptibly, while I bandy words in a foreign tongue.
Well,
Tawfiq suffered a severe stroke, though this poem is written much earlier than the incident. I feel it's like it was prophetic. It's called Talking to Myself. Sometimes now I catch myself talking to myself. A loud half phrase or a word, never anything more, and making gestures with the hands which no one understands. It was not like that before. Those who have seen or heard must think I'm going mad. I am not going mad. Just a little bit. I hate myself for it, but pass it off with a laugh. How did it start? Once, I thought I was all heart. Not of late. I am in a state.
Well, thank you. What we're going to do now is I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to read one or two of their own poems. Poems they may have written 30 years ago or 40 years ago, or poems they may have written yesterday. It's up to them. And once that is over, then we will have a short discussion amongst ourselves and then open it up to you if you'd like to ask any questions about this evening's events. So let me go through the same order, starting with Khaled, and ask him to read his poems. Just put your mics off.
This poem was written when we used to have 5-year plans, and the title is Jinnah. Far away from the valleys of his hard-won dream, our blaring minarets blend with the fearful beauty of naked children caught between rigors of floods and 5-year plans. On this anniversary, sitting on a heap of tattered phrases and faded newsreel shots, we look in vain for his relevance. This thin, precise man once bent our imprecise will to survival and identity. Now gone beyond the stab of our betrayals, he shames us with his permanence.
Meena.
I have no idea why we are reading time ago. It was called Perspective, and it was a monthly digest. And this issue that I have before me is July-August 1968. So this is 3 years after the publication of First Voices. I think it's very precious to us because it carries an introduction by Tawfiq Rafat, whom, as Ahmed rightly said, was our mentor and our guru, and so much else as a person. I think as we read his poetry, of course, read beautifully by Navid, we remember the man. We remember the man so much more. He does come through in his poetry, but he was quite an exceptional human being. And I think we all need to pay tribute to him. So I said the only reason why I would even dare to read here is because he wrote the introduction to what were then 6 young poets, which includes the 4 of us sitting here. And the poem that I will read is the one that he seemed to like. And I can't even find it. I don't know where it is. You'll just have to bear with me for a second. Here it is. It's called Funeral. Humpbacked, I walked through the choked streets. Someone waved, and turning to greet, I saw a funeral. It wasn't there earlier. I had noticed the coal dust and the littered orange peels, the half burnt out neons and ubiquitous transistors. People still drank hot tea. Lost among the blown steam, a sunken-cheeked man brought samosas. I watched the spreading grease devour the letters on the newspaper. Filth floated serenely in gutters still. Colored kites bobbed decorously on the rooftops. I did not mutter a hasty benediction or incline my head. There was no relevance. Thank you.
Thank you, Samina. I'm very proud to say that Athar Tahir continues to write poetry and is probably one of our leading poets. Although unfortunately he's not published as much as he should be published, but I now will ask him to read a couple of his new poems.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'm going to read 2 poems from my latest book, which is the 5th collection of poems called The Gift of Possession. This was launched last month, and the first of the poems is called Cordoba. It is part of the Andalusian Qasida section in this volume of work, and it's based on a journey I took with my father in 1995. And you will find allusions to Andalusian history, Allama Iqbal's famous poem on the Masjid of Kartaba, and of course my father's failing heart. He died soon afterwards. Cordoba. As whining as the Guadalquivir streets with women in black shawls, wall pots and balconies with geraniums lead us to it. Once tread barefoot, now sandals, shoes and sneakers make secular this sacred space. Pillars as slender and reaching as date palm trunks, arc like palm leaves, arch upon arch. The shade so deep and grove cool. As if the sun did not exist, as if the desert generations had carried could not intrude in this satiating oasis. The horseshoe arch pointing east, gold glimmered at camera crowds, then tarnished into mosaic gloom. Prompted you at a remove to stand, bow, prostrate, your head on the flagstone floor. The dust did not matter. This was pure dust. To establish a continuum. You had come where you had always wanted to come, spurred by childhood lure of a poet's verse, lamenting the land won, loved for 6 centuries, called home, then lost. And the cathedral, a shaft driven through the heart to assert reconquest of this little paradise. All was silent for a long while, save the shadow shuffling as if of time. What rise, what fall, you murmured through the bruised silence. As winding as the streets, the river pointed us to another town, where boats were burnt into a proverb, and which, so many generations later, saw the last boats leave. The second poem is called Dictators, and it comes from the same book and from the section called Requiem Sonnets. This is the last of the 4 sonnets which I dedicated to Benazir, who was my contemporary, Benazir Bhutto, and also a friend. Sonnet number 4, Dictators. He was not the first, and he may not be, if politicians are what they were, the last. The first would neither run nor flee, even after people called him a cur, and paraded stray dogs in the street and beat them with his name. The next lost half the country and pickled to death with women and neat pegs of drink. The third was God's holy warrior, whose legacy still persists in a catchery of religion and drugs, Kalashnikovs and happy terrorists. He exploded high above this pure land. Then the fourth had his jolly venal turn. But will meddled, tickled men ever learn? Thank you.
I'm going to ask Henna now. Henna is also a practicing poet, and I hope she'll also read one of her new or 2 of her new poems.
I'm going to read one poem from my 7th volume of English poetry, and this is called A Lost Word, and then I'll read another which I wrote yesterday. A Lost Word. The tide mixed salt, spray, water, in the gleaming sun, radiance of color, dancing in your eyes like the universe of stars. I water loneliness with a mountain of words, a garden salad of thoughts, eaten in bits and pieces by the slice of time on your balcony, overbearing windows beneath the waterfall. Tell me not to tell you anything, and I will think of all those times when you know everything for no reason, before and after as it happens. Yeah, here it is. This one is called Hazaras. Blood drips from a face, the head stumbles, limbs fall from a bullet of bodies, cries, protest, killed belief. Tolerance shrouds screams with tears. Horror, torture, anguish. Words push reality into a prism. Government promises and promises are broken. Who will avenge the death of innocents? Who will speak for the dead? Who will stop the massacre? Pakistan turns into a killing field. Change will pluck the guns from killers, force them to seek tolerance and end this war. Who will bring change? Unite change today and change tomorrow. Destiny is in our hands. We must lead ourselves into action. Be tolerant, be wise, create peace.
I'm going to read you two of my earlier poems, which were written during the fourth insurgency in Baluchistan, 1973 to 79. Some of these poems were published abroad, but never before have these poems either been read or been published in Pakistan. So I'm doing this for the first time. The first poem is called, I Have No Way of Saying This Gently. The shade of the tree is delicately stretched, swaying with the breeze from east to west. Around me children beautiful come and go, barefoot in rags, their shiny faces raised to the merciless sun. The recent mother girl comes and sits before me, hiding her face in a chadar, pushing back her single plait of thick black hair. Sister, I have no other way of saying this gently. Your husband killed in battle, your brother lost, freedom's hunger claimed them, and their love for this soil, these rocks. She sits stunned, then slowly shakes from side to side, trying not to sob, pushing back her plait of thick black hair. A single tear travels down the curve of cheek. Now their eyes have nowhere to go, to wander. There is no light. But I could not ask death to come a better way in battle for their country with their comrades, she says. They did not run or show fear. Tell me straight. I easily reply. They stood upright as spears, brave as lions, their honor intact. They will always be remembered. O woman, mutilated by the absence of so many, your broken dreams, like the jagged pieces of the moon, now pierce me. So a ring of stars is smashed. To show the light of galaxies, sitting under this tree of silence, surrounded by the noise of children's play, she pushes back her plait of shining black hair. I'm going to read you another one called I Have Long Owed You for G. I have long owed you words, the depth debt of love you have showered on this battered, dented man. I walk with great hollows inside me, cutting deep like trees chopped in their trunk. And your sad, delicate patience has patched me in places I had long ago forgotten. For a long time I have lain anchor in an unknown sea, hearing only your footsteps on the smooth beach, rising and falling. You have carried your burdens of absence and loss for too long. The clouds are in moody turmoil, shifting from black to white to disappear in a clear blue sky. And I have seen the rain gather in your sad, beautiful eyes when you reach that state where so much ceases to matter. Nights such as these, I just care for your innocence, your outpourings of clarity. But with you, I have shaken off winter prematurely and called in spring, for seasons dissolve in your fragile hands. And in all my withered days, I have never been touched by such tenderness. And the last one is called, a few lines called Refugee Winter. The roads are blocked, the gorges impassable, landslides of snow echo all along the mountains. In the freezing ink of night, the thin winding river disappears under a sheet of ice. Dogs snarl hungrily as huts crash down on weary sleepers. It is desperately cold. Winter is so hard in a strange country. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Nivi now to read her poems.
I'm going to read 3 poems, so I'm going to crave your indulgence a little bit. My beginnings in English poetry have navigated me towards writing in Urdu and Punjabi, and I'd like to share these with you. But before I begin, I'd like to say a word about the man who made this possible. Tawfiq started me off on my journey of writing in English, and Shoaib Hashmi encouraged me to write in Urdu and Punjabi. Shoaib is not here today, but he is with me in spirit. He thought my verse in Urdu was good enough to show to the great master Faiz. Unfortunately, Faiz Sahab fell ill and passed away before he could see my little scratchings. But I will cherish this particular thought always, that perhaps my work in some way was good enough for the grand old man to see. The first poem is called Another Country. Willows trail spider limbs dipped in Pharaoh's gold. The forest flames and jacaranda spills lilac on pregnant greens. Bougainvillea explodes magenta, white, cyclamen, and jasmine scents head, heart, body. There is a secret country deep within me, peopled with images of you, echoing with the sound of your voice. Here, magnolias wax elegantly and orchids bloom the year round. But love, love is yet another country. ये वो नज़्म है जो शोएब साहब ने सोचा कि इसमें इतनी कुछ बीज हैं कि फैज़ साहब को दिखाई जा सके, तो आपकी इजाज़त हो तो मैं पेश करूं। जब तुम्हारा साया मेरे वजूद को हल्के से छूता हुआ आगे यूं निकला, जैसे धुंध में लिपटी हुई तस्वीर हो, रेशम के बदन से रात गई खुशबू की लपक हो, मैंने तुम्हें पहचाना नहीं। क्या तुम ही बरसों से मेरी रूह की तंग गलियों में करवटें लेते हुए बेदार होने को थे? आज जब आईने में झांका तो सूरत कुछ बदली सी पाई। डरती हूं उस रोज से जब पसीने से टिमटिमाते हुए सुर्ख गाल बदलती नजर के सर्द झोंके से जर्द पड़ जाएंगे, जैसे शफाफ चश्मों में गदले पानी मिल जाएंगे, या बच्चे मैली उंगलियों के निशान नए रोगन पे छोड़ जाएंगे। मैं अपने जहन से तुम्हारा एक एक खाका उखाड़ फेंकूंगी, जैसे खाना बदोश थक कर रात की तारीकी में सो जाएंगे।
Okay, oh sorry, you got one more.
लूण है तत्ता, लूण है बहुता, मिठा थोड़ा, रोटी ठंडी पानी तत्ता, मुंह वटा के लगा सौण, नेरी वगी अंबी डिगी, चोरी खा खा उड़िया तोता, फर फर करदी गुड्डी वांग मींह विच भिजी कोठे डिगी, की जाना मैं कौन? खबरे किदे बूए बन्नी, वाज मेरी सुनदा कौन? पाटा चग्गा त्रोपे लावा, चिरदे दिल नू सीवे कौन?
Well, that's wonderful to see you recite poetry in 3 languages. I mean, it's more than most of us can do. Thank you very much. Listen, I'm going to open a discussion now, and let me first ask our panel, and then I'll open it up further. Khaled, let me ask you, I mean, are young people today writing poetry in English? And why has there been this flowering of English prose writers, fiction writers from Pakistan, and yet poetry seems to be on the wane?
That is quite clear, because if you approach any reputable publisher with your collection of poems, the answer is, why don't you write a novel for us? But if you read the government college magazine Ravi, lots of young people are writing poems in it, just as we used to do in our times. So poetry is not dead in that way. Maybe it is our first experience of language and our emotionality which moved us to poetry. But I think across the globe, poetry is going out of fashion for some reason. Because in our times, I remember there was a poet laureate in England, and we always knew his name. There is one now too, but I don't know what his name is. The poetry magazines are also not available. In our days, they used to be available on the bookstalls. So there is a kind of decline in poetry writing. Maybe in the coming days, when we have had enough of prose, we'll go back to it.
I think this is largely cyclical. There are periods when a certain kind of writing emerges and others go into partial decline. I disagree with Ahmed when he says that poetry isn't being written. It's not being published. That's a separate issue. There's a lot of poetry that's being written, and some very fine poetry. I'm personally witness to some wonderful writing by young people at school and university, just as I was at one time. And as Khaled has pointed out quite clearly, Oxford University Press is not interested in publishing books of poetry or even fiction for that matter. I think what we have to look at is the fact that we as a generation were tutored by a whole cadre of teachers who were very much immersed in poetry themselves. And I think they influenced us greatly. The departments of English language came much later. There were always departments of English literature. And they were the ones, because we had such a huge part of the syllabus was made up of poetry and poets and so on. I think we were willy-nilly pulled into the vortex, and we started to read a lot more poetry than generations these days, because in their schooling, they don't have as much poetry in their syllabi as we used to have. So publishing, as well as the fact that we're not exposing our children to enough poetry by teachers who are not really well versed in poetry themselves. So it's a paradigm shift, but I think it's temporary.
I think both the causes and effects which Khaled and Navid have enunciated hold some truth in them. But I think more than that, there is no forum, because at the time when you were writing and this issue came out of Perspective, and then a few years later there was another issue of Perspective in which there were again 4 young poets, myself and a few others included, and also introduced by Tawfiq Rafat. So there was a place where you could get yourself published, even as you were students. We had Perspective, we had Pakistan Digest, we had Pakistan Review, and then we had a whole number of other smaller school magazines like the college magazine of Government College, the Ravi, in which the first flowerings of a poet began to be noticed. And once a person sees, at least once I saw my work in print for the first time, it really encouraged me to explore this medium further and to seek out people who could help me. I was published in the Ravi, and I published in the Pakistan Review, which was brought out by Feroz Sons at that time, before I actually met Tawfiq. And when I met Tawfiq, I just suddenly discovered that he was a person who had not only the knowledge of poetry, but also the craft of poetry. You see, it's very important to understand that to write a good poem, you must know the craft. And this is something that Nivi pointed out when she said he was a carpenter, referring to Tawfiq. He was. And as you all, being slightly senior to us at that time, must have realized the emphasis that he put on craftsmanship. Because words are, after all, rough words. I mean, you could fashion a script with it, you could fashion a novel with it, but if you were going to fashion poetry, then there are certain requirements that you need to know. Because words perhaps speak most potently in poetry, because they're short and they're precise and they're exact and they elicit the best possible response from the reader. So that was something which over the years has really gone out of fashion. People just think that because they can put a few words together, they're poets, without realizing that so many other issues that underlie a good poem, you see. So I think, one, publishing, two, mentoring, that over the years there have not been enough of a dynamic core which could help younger poets writing in English to come forward and guide them in their craft.
Well, clearly all of the reasons that have been mentioned have contributed. But I do know that to develop a love for poetry, you need to, from a very young age, to hear it. And whereas in our kindergartens and nursery schools, children are still exposed to some rhymes, but the minute that they enter junior school and middle school, I remember we used to have poetry books that were part of, the book list when it came. I know that the poetry was largely romantic or the classics or whatever, and a lot of it was not something that we fully understood, but we had the Dragon Book of Verse, we had Silver Bells, we had a whole range of books. And we were, some of us, fortunate enough to have teachers who seemed to love poetry. And that was how it was communicated. Now we do have, we have readers which have a few poems. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that we have separate poetry books. So something that, something that grows with you. A language, the emphasis on language. We learnt language through reading a lot and through reading poetry. Now the emphasis is on teaching language rather than teaching language through literature. I may be old-fashioned in this respect, and I know there is a debate about it. But I think to develop a love for something, you have to be exposed to it sufficiently. And I feel that could be partly one of the reasons why young people today are not drawn. The other is quite right, Oxford University Press. The thing that I found so ironic was that the last book of verse that was brought out, of Tawfiq's verse, was brought out by the family.
Yes.
I cannot imagine a poet of his stature not finding a publisher to bring out his verse. So, his last poems.
I think Athar faced the same kind of situation.
There's not enough poetry that is published, so there's very little poetry that gets read, and the lesser that gets read, the lesser that gets published. So it's a catch-22 situation, or the chicken before the egg or the egg before the chicken. But I have had to self-publish